Good afternoon and welcome to today's grand round, which is on the topic of obstetric clinical care. And I'm so glad to see an almost full house, and that is, I think, thanks to Dr. Sunesh in this department. Dr. Deka has asked me to remove the mask, and so it is. This topic is being presented by the Department of Anesthesiology, Pain Medicine, and Critical Care. And it is a topic of great interest and importance, primarily because it has the potential for improving maternal mortality and outcomes, especially of very critically ill obstetric patients. And in addition to doing this, it gives us an opportunity to understand the unique problems and challenges which we see in this specific group of patients. And it also provides us with a lot of ideas to how to find a way forward and how to develop our institutions to cater to this group of people. So today the presenting team is led by Dr. Vimmi Rewari with Dr. Bikash Ray. And the demographic and the mortality data will be presented by our DM residents, Dr. Karthik and Dr. Gaurav. And obstetric critical care is probably one of the best examples of organized teamwork. So we are going to have valuable input from the Department of Obs and Gynae, from Dr. Vatsala Dadwal, and from the Department of Cardiology by Dr. Kambuj. So now, without any further ado, I will request Dr. Vimmi to start the proceedings.
Thank you, ma'am, and very good afternoon to everyone. Before we proceed to our data presentation, I would like to give you a brief review of what obstetric critical care is and its significance. So how do you define, not very comfortable, how do you define obstetric critical care? It is the specialized management of critically ill obstetric patients using a coordinated interdisciplinary approach, which actually is targeted to the needs of both the mother as well as the fetus. So pregnancy, as we all know, is a normal physiological state. However, it has the potential to turn pathologically, where it can affect the well-being of both the mother as well as the fetus. So why do obstetric patients need critical care? Largely because of two reasons. One, the physiological changes that occur during pregnancy can worsen the underlying comorbidities such as valvular heart disease, or the complications that occur during pregnancy such as eclampsia or preeclampsia, or during delivery such as amniotic fluid embolism may necessitate ICU admission. The successful management of these patients depends on the input from a multidisciplinary team, which is primarily composed of an obstetrician, a critical care physician / anesthesiologist, which is supported by a neonatologist, cardiologist, and a nephrologist. So according to the data from the confidential inquiries into maternal morbidity and mortality across the UK, it was seen that there is an increased incidence of maternal mortality due to indirect causes, which is mainly cardiac disease and sepsis, and a decrease in the direct causes of maternal mortality. And the committee recommends that all obstetric patients should get multidisciplinary care. One should watch out for early obstetric warning signs, and provision of obstetric critical care services should be readily available for all women who show signs of rapid deterioration or show signs of sepsis. So why have the indirect causes of maternal mortality increased? Primarily because of, again, a few reasons. One is the cultural changes and the advancements in the artificial reproductive technologies, which allows women to conceive at an older age. And with older age comes increased incidence of chronic medical conditions such as diabetes, hypertension, and coronary artery disease. Almost 10% of all obstetric ICU admissions are associated with some form of chronic comorbidities. Also, advancement in medical sciences has led to increased life expectancy in chronic diseases such as cystic fibrosis and congenital heart disease. And more women with these diseases are able to conceive and reach childbearing age. In certain set of data from the United States, it was seen that hospitalization of parturients with congenital heart disease has increased by 13.5% in the years 1995 to 2004. So the overall maternal mortality is actually just the tip of the iceberg. The vast base is comprised of by an entity called severe acute maternal morbidity, or the near miss. The near miss is actually derived from the aviation industry and is not really entirely true for this scenario. So like I was saying, severe acute maternal morbidity is a life-threatening obstetric complication which needs an urgent medical intervention in order to save the life of the mother. And its global prevalence is about 0.01% to 8.23%, and a case fatality ratio of almost as high as 37%. So what that means is that all ICU obstetric admissions are actually indirect indicators of severe acute maternal morbidity. So with this background in mind, we decided to present this scan round and to assess and analyze all obstetric admissions to the ICU and to evaluate their epidemiology, the associated comorbidities, indications for ICU admission, the various ICU interventions that we performed on these patients, and the incidence of maternal mortality, the causes, and the risk factors. So we did a retrospective analysis of all our obstetric admissions, which means all women who were either pregnant or within 6 weeks of postpartum period from January 2011 to December 2020, who were admitted in our AB8 ICU, which is a 12-bedded ICU under the Department of Anesthesiology, Pain Medicine and Critical Care. It's a mixed medical surgery. So, like I was saying, ICU is based on a hybrid model, which means that we have an on-site intensivist who is responsible for taking all decisions related to the management of the patient with active support from obstetricians, cardiologists, and nephrologists. So, for the presentation of the data, I would like to invite Dr. Karthik.
Thank you, ma'am. In this analysis, various data were collected, which included demographic data, comorbid conditions associated with pregnancy, need for ICU indication, need for mechanical ventilation and hemodialysis, complications developed during ICU stay, and ICU survival. In our institute, nearly 24,400 deliveries were conducted in the last decade, out of which nearly 1% require ICU admission. The annual percentage of obstetric admission as opposed to total deliveries were ranges between 0.7 to 2% nearly. Out of 4,500 admissions, nearly 6.37% were admitted in our ICU. The yearly percentage of obstetric admission as opposed to total ICU admission ranges from 3 to 9%. The age of our patients vary from 19 to 39 years with a mean age of 27 years. The gestation age of our parturients vary from 6 weeks to 40 weeks with a mean age of 31 weeks. The mean Apache score was 9.63, ranged between 0 to maximum of 32. The median length of ICU stay was 3 days. Majority of our patients were postpartum patients and only 7% were antepartum. This pie chart illustrates maximum antenatal patients were unbooked and only 19% were booked. This chart demonstrates various modes of deliveries. Nearly 2/3 underwent C-section, 16% delivered vaginally, and the rest includes MTP and ectopic. Here we see various modes of anesthesia received by our patients. Of the 286 patients, 199 received anesthesia for C-section and ectopic pregnancies. Majority of the procedures were performed under general and regional anesthesia. Six procedures were performed under combined general and regional anesthesia. Here we highlight various indications for ICU admission. Maximum number of patients were admitted for postoperative monitoring, followed by hemodynamic instability, requiring invasive lines and hemodynamic support. 3% were admitted with altered sensorium. This slide highlights of the total number of patients admitted, nearly 48% had comorbidities associated with pregnancy, out of which valvular heart disease constitutes the maximum of 57%, followed by congenital heart disease and kidney disease. A few patients had autoimmune disease like SLE and Takaisu On admission, 68 patients had organ failure. A large proportion of them had cardiovascular and renal dysfunction, which constitutes to 37 and 33% respectively. Hepatic and respiratory failure were least encountered. Maximum patients received invasive monitoring and for vasopressor administration, and 2 patients received ECMO support. This bar diagram illustrates various needs for mechanical ventilation. Nearly 49% required mechanical ventilation, and most common reasons are hemodynamic instability and respiratory failure. Out of 140 patients, 72% required mechanical ventilation for more than 48 hours, and the rest were weaned off within 48 hours. Here we highlight nearly 28% required vasopressor support for hemodynamic instability. The usage of noradrenaline is comparatively higher than other vasopressors. Here we could see the duration of vasopressors required by our patients. Majority of them were able to be weaned off within 24 hours and 9 patients required prolonged support. After applying multivariate logistic model, we found SOFA score, mechanical ventilation, and organ dysfunction are the 3 main factors strongly associated with vasopressor use. However, SOFA and mechanical ventilation are statistically significant. Coming to complications developed during ICU stay, nearly 5% developed the complications during ICU stay. Majority of them had infective complications like hospital-acquired pneumonia and ventilator-associated pneumonia, followed by catheter-associated urinary tract infection and central related infection, and 5 developed acute kidney injury during ICU stay. I would like to invite Dr. Bikash to proceed with the discussion.
Thank you, Karthik. So, before discussing about the demographics and epidemiology of the patients that are admitted at the ICU, it is important to know the flow of patients to our ICU. Most of the patients to our ICU are from the emergency ward or the labor room and from the operation theatre. And after the recovery, they go back to the ward, respective ward, and from there they get discharged. Okay, so as Dr. We've discussed, our ICU is a hybrid model, based on a hybrid model, where the intensivist is the primary decision maker, along with the help from the obstetrician and cardiologist and other department. And it has been found that a hybrid model has a better result in terms of morbidity and mortality rather than an open or closed ICU model. And this ICU is capable of providing a level 3 or level 4 care for maternal critical care, which is mainly advanced respiratory support or advanced hemodynamic support. So regarding the cause and how many patients are admitted to the ICU, if you go for the Western literature, the developed country has an incidence of around 2.6 to 7.3 per thousand deliveries. And if you see the Indian data, it is quite higher. It is between 26 to 56 per thousand deliveries. In our ICU, we have a rate of around 11.7 per thousand baths. The discrepancy between the developed and developing countries are mainly because of the availability and accessibility of maternal health care, quality of preventive care that is present, time to access the hospital or the critical care, availability of resources and facility for advanced intervention, and most importantly, the lack of level 2 care, where the level 2 care is provided for a patient who has only one organ dysfunction and a basic support can be given. However, in our setups or most of the Indian setup, we don't have a level 2 care, so the most of the patients are either directly shifted to a tertiary center or a apex care which has a capability of giving a level 3 or level 4 care. Also, the criteria for critical care admissions vary across countries, across region or different continents. Obstetric admissions has a total percentage of ICU admission, that is the ICU utilization by the obstetric critical care patients. The data shows it's around 16%. However, in the Indian data is very less. It is around 0.4 to 1.8%. And in our hospital, again, we found that around total admissions, 6% of the patients are from obstetrical critical care. This is a bit higher rather than the Indian data. And again, as described, this is mainly because of the lack of level 2 care. Also, we have much more patients which are unbooked and referral patients, which require a much more high vigilance and monitoring, so that they are directly shifted to our ICU. And even the obstetric patients which require critical care has a primary importance, because it's always better to identify them before there's some complication develops. Mostly maternal early warning signs and symptoms are used. Nowadays, obstetrical early warning scores and obstetrically modified TUI SOFA scores are most frequently used for diagnosing these patients. Again, disease-specific or disease-related obstetric scoring system like a stroke shock index, a mini PIRAS or sepsis in obstetric scores has been used for specific disease conditions. This is the obstetric early warning score, which is a score based on mostly with clinical parameters without any lab values, and it can be filled up or it can be maintained by the paramedics or even sister in the ward level or a labor room. And this is a color coded, and easily you can identify the patients who are required any further monitoring or critical care management. And this is a score which has been validated in obstetrically or maternally critical patients also retrospectively. With the onset of new quick SOFA scores, which has only 3 parameters, and according to the physiological modifications for the pregnancy, the score criteria has been modified. This is very easy without any lab values, and it can be done by anybody who is present at the bedside. and it is a very good indicator for identifying patients who require critical care. The validation of this score in obstetric critical patients is still awaited. Going the causes of ICU admissions, if you search the literature, you have different incidents or different percentage of patients or different causes for which they are admitted. It depends on the criteria on which they are chosen. Either it's a disease-based criteria or organ-based dysfunction-based criteria or management-based criteria. If you saw the most large studies in the Western literature, the most common cause for ICU admission are hypertensive disease of the pregnancy or obstetric hemorrhage. And it has been found that between developing and developed countries, the incidence of both of hypertensive disease of pregnancy and obstetric hemorrhage does not vary significantly. If you see in our data also, here is the study which is published last year, where again the hypertensive disease of pregnancy and obstetric hemorrhage are the most common cause. But if you see our data, most of the patients are for post-operative monitoring and followed by hemodynamic instability and respiratory distress. The similar kind of data is also obtained from a Australian study where most common cause of ICU admission are hemodynamic instability or respiratory complications. The lack of hypertensive diseases of pregnancy in our ICU is mainly because most of the patients are managed very adequately at the ward level or level 1 by the obstetricians. Demographic, coming to advanced maternal age, that is age more than 35 years, has been found to be a risk factor for ICU admission and further complications. And in many studies, it has been found that up to 20 to 23% of the patients are in the age group. However, in our ICU admissions, we found hardly any patients or few patients only who are more than 35 years age. And the average age group is only 27 years. And most of the patients are obviously postpartum rather than antepartum. Mode of delivery, if you see the literature, around 40 to 60% of the ICU admission are after cesarean section. In our center also, we have a data which suggests that most 60% has cesarean section for ICU admission. And 60% of them have general anesthesia. However, the trend in few years, on the last decade has changed. Most of the patients in our setup previously used to have general anesthesia because of their comorbidities and as they are much more sicker. However, with the change in technology and increase in invasive monitoring, although nowadays also we go for a higher percentage of GA, most of the patients that get trained towards use of regional anesthesia along with invasive monitoring. In the US study, it has been found that 1/5 of the ICU admissions have cardiac comorbidities, and most of them are because of the congenital heart disease. In our data, we have a cardiac disease, but most of our patients are valvular heart disease, followed by congenital heart disease. This is mainly because of the prevalence of rheumatic fever and its complications in our country. 40 to 48% of the patients require mechanical ventilation among those who are admitted in the ICU for obstetric or maternal critical care. Indian data is a bit higher, with around 60 to 58% of the patients requiring mechanical ventilation. In our hospital also, in our ICU, we have around 50% of patients who require mechanical ventilation after ICU admission. Mostly because most of the patients are unbooked patients and they present very late with a higher critical SOFA Apache scores. The vasopressors, around 20 to 40% of the patients require vasopressors, and as we found from the regression analysis that a SOFA score or need for mechanical ventilations are associated with vasopressor use. That the change in use of type of vasopressor over the years, previously it was much more dopamine and NORAD based vasopressor use. With the change and with the improvement in guidelines of cervical sepsis incidence, nowadays much more noradrenaline and vasopressors are used rather than dopamine. Complications, if you search the literature, they are not clear because most of the studies, they don't report all the complications that or the complications that is occurring in the ICU. Some selective complications are reported in many of the studies. In our data, we found most of the patients are higher pneumonia, maybe a hospital-acquired pneumonia or a ventilator-associated pneumonia. This is mainly because of the longer duration of ICU stay, followed by acute kidney injury, which is very significantly less compared to the other data. We have only 5 patients who develop new onset acute kidney injury, although few patients have kidney injury at the time of admission. Only 5 patients have acute kidney injury during the stay, mainly because of the advanced monitoring and timely interventions. So now I will request Dr. Gaurav to present the mortality data.
Thank you, sir. Good afternoon, everybody. I will be presenting the mortality stats. The maternal mortality during the last decade was around 13% among all obstetric admissions to our ICU. That is ranging from as low as 6.9% to as high as 23%. And if we go around the cause of maternal mortality, majority of us belongs to sepsis followed by a cardiac disease, nearly constituting 50% each. Only one patient died because of obstetric hemorrhage. If we further dissect about the mortality caused because of sepsis, majority of us belongs to prepural sepsis, 63%. However, we also have 3 patients died because of H1N1 during the epidemic, that is 2016 and 17. So it's for around 50% of total mortality. And among heart disease, as Vikas sir also said, like valvular heart disease constitutes major admission, it also constitutes major cause of mortality among heart disease patients. Closely followed by congenital heart disease, 33%. Then we had 2 patients that has isolated pulmonary arterial hypertension also. And among the 38 patients, majority of patients, the 37 patients were unbooked, whether only one mortality belongs to a booked category. And after applying multiple regression model for various factors to find out to associated with mortality, we found to have high Apache score, and need for mechanical ventilation was associated with decreased survival. Now I will like to call upon Professor Vimi to discuss about mortality stats. Ma'am.
Thank you, Gaurav. So what is the need of talking about mortality in critically ill obstetric patients? Mostly because mortality in obstetric patients is an indicator of the quality of healthcare that we administer to our mothers. And if we analyze the causes, we can find the causes of the increased mortality and also means of addressing the problems. So the mortality in obstetric patients, in critically ill obstetric patients, varies in developed countries and developing countries, obviously. So in developed countries, it ranges from 0% to 11%. On the other hand, in developing countries, the mortality, ICU mortality can be as high as 50%. And this publication is very recent in 2016, where the authors looked at the maternal morbidity in a ICU in Nigeria. If we look at the Indian data, this study is from 2004 from an urban medical college, and they reported a maternal mortality of almost as high as 40%. However, a recent article which looked at the contributory factors for obstetric ICU admission, the ICU maternal mortality was 21.8%. So the reasons for increased mortality are probably the low socioeconomic status, the poor antenatal care, the presence of anemia and malnourishment, and also low availability of ICU beds. Our data shows an observed mortality rate of 13.3%, which is almost equivalent to any of the developed countries. And this is probably due to the fact that ours is a tertiary care center with an ICU with state-of-the-art facilities. A very important point here is that we have a very high priority for ICU bed availability for the obstetric patients. And I think most of the obstetricians here would agree with that. And coupled with this is the excellent perioperative care, both by the anesthesiologists as well as the obstetricians, which leads to a better outcome. So Apache scoring, what is it? Apache scoring is a scoring which is done on admission to critical care, and it basically is a severity risk estimate, and it also predicts mortality. So Apache scoring in obstetric patient actually overestimates mortality. In a recent systematic analysis, the authors looked at the usefulness of the Apache 2 score in obstetric critical care, and they found for an observed mortality rate of 4.6%, the predicted mortality rate as based on Apache 2 scoring is 16.6%, which is way above the observed mortality rate. So the reason for this is the reversibility of certain obstetric conditions like eclampsia and preeclampsia, and the physiological changes of pregnancy lead to altered ranges in almost 7 out of 13 variables which are measured in the Apache 2 score. So in our data, the predicted mortality rate based on Apache is 10 to 13%, which is similar to the observed mortality rate of 13.3%. And the correct estimation of mortality is probably due to the fact that all of our mortality is because of sepsis and heart disease. Then coming to the causes of maternal mortality, already mentioned before, the causes for maternal mortality in developing countries is obstetric hemorrhage and hypertensive disorders versus the developed countries where it is heart disease and sepsis. Our data also reflects that cardiac disease and sepsis are the major contributors to obstetric maternal mortality in the ICU, with only one maternal death due to hemorrhage. The other point to be noted is that the majority of the deaths, almost all the deaths except one, happened in unbooked admissions, and this is probably the poor quality of antenatal care those patients received, or they presented very late to our ED or the hospital, which led with more complications, they were sicker. So obviously the mortality is much higher. Then we looked at the risk factors for mortality. We found that there was no association of age with mortality, which is because of the fact that all our patients were relatively younger with mean age of 27 years. And like Dr. Bikash said previously, age more than 35 years has been associated with increased mortality. Then the next factor which increased mortality was mechanical ventilation. And this has been validated in various other studies. The need for mechanical ventilation increases the mortality. The Apache 2 score is also associated with increased mortality, and high Apache 2 on admission is an excellent predictor of mortality, although it does overestimate mortality in obstetric patients. So before I call the next speaker, I'd like to talk briefly about our experience with obstetric patients with H1N1 infection. So in the last 10 years, we had 6 patients with confirmed H1N1 infection, out of which 5 were in the 3rd trimester and 1 was postpartum. All of them had severe illness and none of them were vaccinated. Maternal outcome was not very good. 50% of these patients did not survive. So this table briefly depicts the clinical characteristics of these patients. And the point to be noted here is that the first 3 are non-survivors. So the PO2 or the oxygen level at presentation for these patients was much lower, 60 to 70 millimeters of mercury as compared to the survivors. And also the initiation of antiviral therapy was much later in these patients as compared to the survivors. Also amongst the non-survivors, all 3 patients required multiple proning sessions, and 2 out of these 3 patients also had ECMO therapy. So this is the patient number 5 who presented to us with very severe illness with H1N1 with 29 weeks of gestation and required proning. And this picture I put here just to highlight the problems that we face in proning these patients. Like you can see, we have to take care that the abdomen doesn't get compressed too much, and we place the bolsters under the pelvis and the chest. So it's not easy to prone these patients. And this is just to tell you the severity of illness. The X-ray of the same patient, the one on the left, is at admission, where you can see it's quite bad with multiple opacities in both lung fields, and the one on the right is at admission, at discharge. So now I would like to call Dr. Vatsala to talk about obstetric, role of an obstetrician in critical care. Thanks. So good afternoon. So the role of obstetricians, we start from the beginning because we look after the patient in the antenatal period, intrapartum, postpartum. And what is important is, like, patients whom we see in the antepartum period, we think they're high risk, are likely to have problems and require critical care. We usually refer and discuss with our colleagues. Similarly, in the intrapartum period, but sometimes some patients may unexpectedly fall sick and may require critical care. So this has already been covered. So it is a multidisciplinary approach, and definitely the obstetricians and the critical care specialists are the helm of affairs, and we need to involve other specialists and neonatologists if the mother is pregnant. So when we call for a transfer to ICU, then I think we need to have our records correctly done when the residents are shifting, and involve the consultant on cover before they shift the patient. So they need to put the risk factors, the medical history, obstetric history properly, the blood test, all the imaging reports should be given at that point on shifting, the vitals of the patient, the pertinent abdominal vaginal examination, and if she's pregnant, about the fetus, fetal well-being should be entered. And also if the patient has had a surgery or is after delivery, if she's had a hemorrhage or intra-abdominal bleeding, which has required some packing, or if she has a uterine balloon in situ, has had an embolization, all these things have to be written and told to the anesthetist. And we should also put in our recommendations and management plan.
So the obstetrician's role is important because we are the primary person responsible, and the management would depend on whether she's antepartum or postpartum. And for managing the DO, maternal fetal, it's always the mother who is of paramount importance. And the fetal status is generally predicated on optimizing the maternal condition. And medical interventions and diagnostic imaging should not be withheld for the sake of the fetal concern. If necessary, we should go ahead with that to optimize her outcome. And as obstetricians, we provide expertise when weighing risk and benefits of interventions such as medications or diagnostic imaging, interpret vital signs and laboratory parameters because they are affected by pregnancy. We also give recommendations regarding fetal monitoring if it is an antenatal patient, and delivery planning if indicated. And it is important that we also do frequent daily rounds in the ICU and communicate with the colleagues there. And also, if the patient requires any other surgical intervention beside delivery, we are the ones who are going to make the decision. So first of all, it is important to know what the reason for her deterioration which led her to the critical care unit. Is it a medical or obstetric disorder? Because we know that if it is obstetric disorder like a HELLP syndrome, severe preeclampsia, acute fatty liver of pregnancy, we know that prompt delivery is important, and that is going to reverse the progression of that is going to improve her condition. So we should know when to ask for a termination of pregnancy. Whereas if it is a medical disorder, it may, most of the time, it is not going to improve by delivery. So we should not unnecessarily rush into terminating the pregnancy. Then again, whatever condition she is in, what is the impact on her life and what is the impact on the fetal health? So we know, as far as obstetric conditions, some of the conditions we know the mother is going to improve after delivery. So we go ahead with terminating the pregnancy if she's antenatal. Or if there is urgent fetal distress, then we may need to do an urgent delivery, but then again it will depend on the period of gestation and other things and her condition, because you first need to stabilize the mother. And whether we need to do a vaginal or a cesarean or what anesthesia, then we have to discuss with our anesthetist friend, and also depends on the maternal clinical status and also the fetal status as to which route. But as also shown in the data, majority of the critical women are delivered by cesarean section because we know we don't know how long the labor may take and it is unpredictable. So before planning for delivery, we have to optimize the patient, like if there is time, we need to give antenatal steroids, pulmonary maturity if she's between 24 to 34 weeks, involves a neonatologist, correct hypertension, hypovolemia. If she is having seizures, control her seizures and blood pressure. If she's an anticoagulant, we have to stop the anticoagulants and look at the coagulant status, because many of the women are like the ones who are like have prosthetic valve, maybe an anticoagulant, and we also have to look at the coagulation profile, especially if she is in DIC or something. Fetal monitoring, if the woman is antenatal in the ICU, would depend on the gestational age. So again, estimating the correct gestational is important, because if there is fetal distress, whether we need to intervene or not will depend on the gestational age. Also, we have to discuss with the family with that, have to involve the neonatologist, and it will also depend on the maternal status, whether it is feasible to intervene at that time to deliver or not. So we usually would do a fetal heart racing, or we do ultrasound monitoring for the fetus. Again, during fetal monitoring, if there is distress, it may be related to obstetric events like placental abruption or eclamptic seizures. But it also may be a pointer that the mother is not in the optimum state, or maybe one of her organ function is deteriorating, like she may be having hypoxia or hypotension, which may reflect as abnormal fetal heart patterns. So if you have abnormal fetal heart pattern, we may need to do prompt delivery. But if it is because of worsening maternal condition, like she has a fall in blood pressure, she's hypoxic, we may do in utero resuscitation and sort of try to improve the maternal condition. In that way, the fetal, we may be able to the fetus would return, resuscitate the fetus in utero, and the fetal heart pattern may come back to normal, and we then don't need to unnecessarily intervene. And what is important to highlight is always these mothers have to be nursed in the lateral position in the ICU. Then again, delivery considerations, when to plan, mode and location of delivery, need for analgesia, anesthesia, and the NICU care. So if the woman is in labor, then we have to decide where to deliver her, whether to deliver her in the labor room or whether she should be delivered in the ICU would depend on her stability, anticipated problems, staffing and expertise, the gestational age. If the baby is pre-viable, we don't mind delivering in the ICU, but if it is near term and a viable baby, we are more comfortable delivering in the obstetric, in the labor room, provided we can care for her, and maybe with the help of the anesthetist or the critical care team, we can deliver her there. Again, whether it is a vaginal delivery, cesarean, or instrumental delivery would be difficult in the ICU. So we prefer to do that in the labor room, and of course adequate anesthesia. So again, like if the woman is postpartum, then we have to evaluate her for vaginal bleeding, for surgical site bleeding. If there is infection and any obstetric source of infection, then we have to look at the therapies. Do we need to discontinue something, like if she's receiving Maxel for eclampsia? So we should say when to stop it. If she's lactating, we have to take care of her lactation. She may require to express milk by breast pump, and also look at the safety of medications during breastfeeding. And some of the surgical issues that we need to decide is re-exploration, reclosure of abdomen, or removal of hemostatic packs. If we suspecting obstetric source of infection, so besides the clinical examination, it is important to do the cultures like blood cultures, high vaginal swab. If she has delivered and the placenta is there, we should do for culture. And we may also require imaging to see if there is any retained products of conception, if there is any pyometra, if there is any abscess in the myometrium, in the pelvis, or in the abdominal cavity. Because we would require surgical management for patients with septic abortion or after delivery. If there are retained products of conception, she would require evacuation. If she has chorioamnionitis, then we would like to deliver, and preferably deliver vaginally. If there is pelvic abdominal collection post-delivery in the postpartum period, we may have to do laparotomy and drainage. If there is myometrial abscess or intramyometrial gas, then she may even require a hysterectomy. So again, what drugs we are using, we have to be careful because many of the drugs can affect the fetal heart racing and the placental perfusion. There may be drugs which affect the mother, and the obstetric drugs may also affect her parameters. The other important time like we need to be there is like if there is a cardiac arrest, then if a resuscitative hysterectomy has to be performed. So if the mother doesn't get her spontaneous circulation within 4 to 5 minutes of starting CPR, then we may have to do a hysterectomy, not only to benefit, like so that the CPR can be done properly, but also if the baby is viable, then the baby may also survive. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. On the outset, let me thank Vimi and Professor Rajeshwari for giving me an opportunity to speak about the role of a cardiologist in obstetric critical care. So, as has been highlighted in the literature review and even our own data, increasingly pregnancies have been complicated with cardiac diseases, and this prevalence is almost up to 4%. As we saw, cardiovascular disease are clearly the leading cause of maternal death and severe morbidity in these critically sick obstetric patients. Of course, additionally, there are 6 to 8% of hypertensive which complicate pregnancy, and that if you consider that under cardiac disease, that further increases the load of patients with cardiac complications. Or mothers with cardiac complications. So, and as we reap our successes of managing both congenital and acquired heart diseases like valvular heart disease, or correcting a lot of complex congenital heart diseases, we bear the difficulty of having mothers with these diseases. And so that again increases the burden of people living with of obstetric complications. And of course, as we discussed, with increasing age of pregnancies, it's now complicated by more and more by diabetes, hypertension, and obesity. And even in West, a lot of obstetric cases are complicated by coronary artery disease. Most of the cases that we see from the West are on congenital heart disease. Almost 3/4 of them, the cardiac cases of congenital heart disease. However, in India, the valvular heart disease predominates, and this is a relatively old publication by Professor Bartla, which showed that the prevalence of cardiac diseases in obstetric care was around 3%, but predominantly, again, rheumatic. But what was very important is that, many a time, almost 13% in this study, were first diagnosed to have heart disease during pregnancy. So really that throws prenatal counseling and everything out of the window. And you really need to face the challenge, sometimes even very late in trimester when the patient is first time diagnosed with heart disease and pregnancy. So to begin with, obviously you need to do a very good obstetric risk assessment if you have that opportunity to plan a pregnancy in a patient with heart disease. And there is a WHO classification which is most widely used about the impact of different heart diseases on obstetric outcomes, and it's from class 1, where there is some of the diseases like MVP, mild MR, and other mild regurgitant lesions or an ASD, which has really no impact on obstetric outcome, to class 4, which I think we all must know, which are real contraindications to pregnancy. And I was surprised in an APS interview in a very prestigious college when faculty was asked, you were not able to come up with the causes which are contraindicated to pregnancy. So, but you must have this in mind: severe pulmonary artery hypertension, severe LV dysfunction, and this is not so much well spoken, but Marfan's with aortic dilatation, and aortic dilatation even in a benign bicuspid aortic valve disease can be catastrophic. So if you have these cutoffs of more than 45 and 50 millimeters respectively, it's an absolute contraindication to pregnancy. Of course, these are valvular heart diseases which you can manage before you advise pregnancy in these patients. Of course, there are other ways of doing risk assessment, and two of them are CARPET, and the other is Zahara risk scores. It's good to have it as obstetricians and management of these patients to know about these risk scores, to know about your patient's risk as she undergoes her journey through the pregnancy. Another thing which everybody should have in mind is the cardiovascular hemodynamics. And it is important to see that, the worst part in terms of cardiovascular hemodynamics happens in the second trimester. And the peak of the load, so to say, on the patient in terms of cardiac problems, and that's when most of the cardiac illnesses are precipitated at the end of the second trimester, around 28 to 30 weeks, where your stroke output, plasma volume are maximum. And then again, of course, there is a severe change in hemodynamics during labor. There's increase in blood volume. There is increase in cardiac output by almost 50%. And there is need for increased oxygen consumption. And third, again, very importantly, is after delivery, is postpartum. Again, there are very massive shifts in hemodynamics. So these are the three places in the journey of this patient that you need to be very careful about precipitating cardiovascular problems, especially in patients with cardiac diseases. And so in a way, they are cardiac stressors. So we need to be very extra careful during this time. There are several cardiac procedures that can be performed in pregnancy if you have a patient who is conceived with cardiac disease. So stenotic lesions, balloon dilatation, surgery is a last resort where you cannot manage medically and or with interventional cardiology. Regurgitant lesions, most of the time you can get away with medical therapy. Of course, sometimes we need vascular interventions like aortic dilatation, which we've done in a patient of cohort and aortoarthritis. But again, only where the patient has LV dysfunction and heart failure would you like to intervene. Otherwise, most of the time you can manage with blood pressure control. Rarely, pulmonary embolism in these patients would need an intervention, and you need to weigh thrombolysis versus angioplasty in these patients. And a few case reports, we've not had an experience, but there are reports of that. And we see more elderly patients, we might have to treat acute coronary syndromes. And another disease very specific to pregnancy is spontaneous coronary artery disease, a complication that can occur even in young pregnant patients, and again requires coronary intervention in several cases. So the best time for catheterization is the second trimester, where you've had organogenesis. So between after the 4th month of pregnancy is when, if you have to electively intervene, is the time we like to do catheter interventions like balloon angioplasty or other interventions. But of course, obviously, we need to minimize radiations. And these are some of the means which we could do as cardiologists to do that. Of course, the most gratifying procedure is a PTMC or a percutaneous balloon dilatation of the mitral valve. And there are a large series published on it. This is again a dated publication from 2001, a series of 84 patients from our department with a very high success rate and a very acceptable radiation exposure and very low maternal and nearly no fetal complications in this case. I mean, it's become so routine now, we've not published this, but further beyond that, but this is a very gratifying procedure, as I said, and on table, you know, just as you dilate the balloon, you can make out a difference in the gasping patient can just start talking to you very normally. So this is one procedure which has very been commonly done and is very satisfying in these patients. Cardiac surgery in pregnancy, as I said, is to be avoided as far as possible. Not so much for maternal care, but with improving support systems for cardiac surgery. Most of the time, the risks for the mother are same as for non-pregnant patients, but the fetal loss is extremely high. So that is a big problem when you intervene surgically in these patients. So if you have to, we would like to delay it to beyond 28 weeks, where you could deliver before surgery. And we know now, actually with even younger deliveries, we can manage the neonates, but this is where it has been shown to be best if you can delay it to 28 weeks and then do this delivery for or a simultaneous delivery and surgery. Other two challenges which are not interventional, but I would just like to bring out, which we see very commonly in our setups, is our patients with pulmonary artery hypertension and prosthetic heart valve. A lot of our patients, some of them conceive without knowing that they have pulmonary artery hypertension. Some of them, because of the social needs, do want to conceive despite the fact that they know that severe pulmonary hypertension is there. This, mind you, has the highest maternal rates reaching up to 50%. So a real serious disease, we have to dissuade our patients as far as possible. The high pulmonary vascular resistance and absolute inability to increase cardiac output is the reason why there is such a high mortality in these patients. And they, of course, require, if they do get pregnant and they want to continue, we need to very close monitoring and probably an elective. It's a little controversial, but most of the large centers which have experience with patients with pulmonary artery hypertension, whether it be idiopathic or secondary, like in Eisenmenger, elective LSCS with regional anesthesia is preferred for these patients. Similarly, a very common problem in our setup is prosthetic heart valve patients, and we need optimum oral anticoagulation management in them. We do not like to switch over to heparin in them if they are on a low dose of warfarin, which is under 5 to 6 milligrams of warfarin. And because it's been clearly shown that teratogenicity is low below these levels, and the switchover per se leads to more and more prosthetic heart valve complications. Of course, prosthetic valve heart thrombosis, if a pregnant patient develops that, is a catastrophic complication and a very challenging situation. And in this setting, as said before, mother takes precedence in terms of management. We do thrombolize these patients. Again, the thrombolysis risks for the mother are not so high. They're just like as in non-pregnant patients, but fetal complication rates are high. So we need to really balance it on a case-by-case scenario and make decisions about thrombolysis in these patients. Just a word about modes of delivery. In terms of cardiac outcomes, vaginal delivery is always preferred because it's associated with less blood loss, less infections, and lower chance of venous thromboembolism. LSCS is generally reserved for obstetric indications. And there are very limited indications for LSCS for cardiac conditions, especially aortic root diseases. If you would prefer LSCS over normal delivery, and in acute intractable heart failure. And some of the people would prefer a cesarean for severe AS, severe PH, and prosthetic valves. But this is something which is debatable. and the individual anesthetist and individual management team and institutions will have their own doctrine. So as said repeatedly during this talk, and it cannot be overemphasized that obstetric critical care is a teamwork. It's a teamwork of cardiology, well, of course, which has a smaller part, I'm sorry saying that first, of obstetricians and the anesthetists, and of course the supporting team of nursing care, pharmacy and social worker support. And it is a upcoming specialty called cardio obstetrics now, and it is very much part of the conferences. If you attend, it is a separate stream in itself, and it requires a specialized clinic. You need to plan for the labor and delivery, and a lot of these patients would live with long-term complications, so you need to plan that. So the bottom line is that we need more integrated approach, which unfortunately we are not very good at this point of time in managing such patients. So we hope that as we have a master plan for integrating healthcare facilities, we have a master plan for managing our patients better. So thank you for patient hearing, and I would request Professor Rajeshwari for a sagacious summary of the topic. Thank you.
So thank you, Dr. Ambuj and Dr. Vatsala for your excellent contributions. So I'll just sum up the problems we have at hand today. So one of the things which have been very bothersome is the very high number of unbooked patients, and we all know, especially the my gynae colleagues know, that a pregnant woman is supposed to be young and healthy and not have any issues, and that combined with a lot of ignorance and non-awareness of medical conditions leads to and a feeling that nobody requires critical care. So critical care remains unanticipated in a very large number of pregnant patients, and this leads to a very high increase in the unbooked admissions. And so when this unbooked patient does land into a crisis and lands into the emergency department, she may be attended to by personnel who are not very well aware of the unique issues of pregnancy and therefore receive substandard management or poor resuscitation, which leads to poor outcome. And to add to this, very often we find that beds may not be available in the central ICUs of a busy hospital because they may be actually being kept for other patients. A small exception being our ICU, where we really have a lot of sympathy for the obstetric patient. So now comes the question that do we really need obstetric HDUs or ICUs? Do they improve outcome? So there have been a few recent publications on this topic, and this article is from Rural Central India, a recent article which examined this problem, and they found that in a high risk or in a high volume maternity case unit, if there is a well managed HDU and an ICU, it definitely reduces the maternal mortality significantly and results in improved maternal outcomes. Then this study was done across some parts of North India, Rohtak, Chandigarh and Delhi, and obstetricians were questioned about their need for ICUs, and the majority of obstetricians felt that there should be a specific designated obstetric HDU or ICU because they felt that their sick patients often faced delays in treatment, the intensivists didn't reach on time, and sometimes ICU beds were not readily available. So this has led to a few guidelines which are available for the setting up of obstetric ICU, especially regarding the number of beds and the staffing. So the FIGO committee in 2019 has examined this issue, and they also remarked on the fact that the central ICUs of hospitals may not have beds for obstetric patients, and so to have 4 to 5 beds inside a labor ward probably would be an ideal way to start an HDU facility inside the labor room itself. Government of India has also laid down a lot of guidelines as to the development of ICUs and HDUs. They feel that the community health centers should have comprehensive emergency obstetric care, the district hospital should have HDUs, and a medical college hospital should certainly have an obstetric ICU. And regarding the number of beds required for these specialties, in a unit which is operating with up to about 250 deliveries per month, a minimum number of 4 ICU beds is required, which can be increased proportionately as the number of deliveries increase. This publication also highlighted the fact that one anesthesiologist or critical care specialist has to be present whether it's in hybrid ICU or whether it's an obstetric ICU. The FIGO guidelines also echo the same comments. So they say that of this team, the obstetric critical care team, the leader must be a specialist in critical care to have the maximal benefit for the sick mother. In fact, our vision is to establish a very nice obstetric critical care facility in the upcoming mother and child block, God willing, in the very recent future. So apart from developing obstetric critical care units, I think it is very important to disseminate the knowledge of recognizing that a patient is ill to as many caregivers as possible, which includes our nurses and sometimes DIs or other people who are looking after these patients. In fact, the guidelines on midwifery services published by the Indian government, they say that apart from looking after uncomplicated deliveries and recognizing the need for referral, these DIs should be taught, or the midwives should be taught about the early warning signs so that they can recognize that the patient has to be shifted to a hospital early. And this was a very interesting article which examined the factors which influence midwives to escalate their care from a normal labor ward to a high dependency unit. And they found that if the patients had an ECG on or were on invasive monitoring, or if the doctors had provided a maternal diagnosis or told them about the neonatal condition, then they tended to refer more patients to the HDU. So which underscores the fact that we have to give very precise guidelines to our staff who are working with us so that they can help us optimally in shifting these sick patients at the timely manner. And as with every other thing, after setting up of an obstetric critical care unit, one has to consistently evaluate its performance on a regular basis by using good quality indicators like outcomes, mortality, satisfaction, length of stay, good communication, and availability of skilled support. As has been now mentioned very many times, I think there is no other specialty which can actually call it a teamwork except from obstetric critical care, because the recovery of the patient hinges on valuable input from every person who's attending to this person. And so with these lines, we come to the end of the CGR. I warmly thank all the people who participated in it and thank you for your attention. Probably we can have some questions on the floor, questions and comments. Yes, please, Dr. Sunesh.
I think I must compliment the department for such excellent CVR. We are in a way lucky. In case we run in problems, within 5 minutes we have anesthesia colleagues coming and helping us because we are in the same building. But there are a lot of places where anesthetists are at a distance and at delay matters. Over the year, what I realized that most of the time, suddenly complication occurs in a patient who is healthy. There is a heart disease patient, we know she likely to have problem, other patient. But most of the time it is young patient, no disease. Suddenly she has PPH, she throws a fit. And then it becomes very important to immediately manage. What I find that in our training of MD of gynae, our residents are not exposed to care of respiratory passages, diseases. So we are not tuned to managing these patients. Whereas in medicine, the surgery department, they every year learn how to take care. So in fact, I'll make a request once again that if MD gynae residents can spend 1 week or 2 weeks in your ICU to learn just basics, not. Once we had a resident from Mizoram with us, one of our VIP became sick. She was in ICU for 3 weeks. I said, you have to look after this patient. He sincerely sat there for 3 weeks. And when he came out of 3 weeks, he knew everything. He could take class for us. How to do setting in a respirator. And so that is, we need to know little basics. And I think it will be big help. As you rightly mentioned, we need to have a obstetric ICU. So with the new building, we have created facility. So we will be in a better position. And of course, we always depend on you for all these problems.
So, Dr. Adisha, I was thinking that you have a lot of cases of DIC as a complication.
Not too many.
Because we invariably used to manage a there's only one patient who developed who died of pathetic disease. That's a intraoperative bleeding after the severe injection. And the bleeding could not be controlled and massive blood loss and transfusion led to additional coagulation. And that's the only patient who I remember had actual DIC. We don't see DIC per se because of obstetric hemorrhage, but yes, sometimes the patients who have DIC as a consequence of sepsis. Yeah.
Primary DIC is very
No, not even one. No,
Not
the ICU.
I go to BMC as expert. So whenever I see my morbidity happen, all the doctors they find big paper, they try to prove that they say for amniotic fluid embolism, even if it was not. And so they say it's inevitable condition, so we are not at fault if we had.
But fortunately for us, in our setup, the incidence of AFP is extremely low. At least patients are not very high. One patient this must be before 2011. In the day, this
We didn't have any COVID test.
yeah.
Also, the amniotic pregnancy is a diagnostic exclusion. So you have to exclude all the things. So you cannot be sure kids the amniotic unless otherwise you have to all the probability ruled out.
I also feel that given the very high incidence of deaths or mortality due to cardiovascular disease, I think that begs some kind of more work, especially if we work with our cardiologists, whether we can find anything to prevent them or whether we can upscale our interventions or management of these patients. They're all so young, and I think valvular heart disease certainly. I mean, something should be, we should be able to do something about it. It's always been bothering me a lot because sometimes they go into those acute pulmonary edema or, they have such a tight stenosis. In fact, I think Dr. Ambuj may remember and Vatsala may remember that we sent a patient from the labor room, from the maternity OT for PTMC. I mean, she was at full term. So she came back and after 6 hours after the heparin had worn off, we did the cesarean. And as you rightly said, she went gasping and she came back smiling. So
And regarding things like category 4 where they shouldn't conceal, but patients, I mean, we have patients, they're post-graduate. One patient was post-graduate to looking from top country. She had Eisenmenger syndrome. She was told absolute contraindication pregnancy, still she conceived. Her procreated so much, She took risk and she was, there the case of India also when I was examining her. She delivered a baby girl. She was smiling on her patient, second or third day she died. But even at that time, they were, she could hand over her progeny to the coming generation. And probably husband married again and the baby was being to operate. So they, I don't know what to do.
That's social for idiopathic PAH, and we tried to persuade her friends to.
So they saw like 40% water in chemistry. Another patient also coming, I did clear on her. She had a baby girl, she survived somehow. I can remember. I said it was a miracle that we survived. And she said, Dr. Sharma, you have to do this miracle again because I want a baby.
I thank all of you once again for attending this tandem. Thank you so much.